So the first session is improving the trustworthiness of AI systems in health and care. And we have got the moderator, who is Brhmie Balaram, Head of AI Research and Ethics at NHSX. So welcome, Brhmie. Hopefully you're going to come on the screen. Hello. Hey.
Thanks, Doris. Good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry. Were you going to say more?
No, just saying excited, looking forward to it. I'm sure everyone else is. Have a great session.
Thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brhmie Balaram. I'm the head of AI ethics in the NHS AI lab, and I'm here today with Lizzie Barclay, medical director at Aidence, which is a company that specializes in AI-powered applications for oncology. I'm also here with Mavis Machirori, senior researcher in justice and equalities at the Lovelace Institute, which aims to ensure that data and AI work for people in society. And finally, also with me today is Brent Mittelstadt, senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, which focuses on the social science of the internet. So our discussion today will focus on tools that have been developed to audit and assess algorithms which could be used in health and care to improve the trustworthiness of AI systems. These tools range from offering technical fixes for problems such as bias to supporting self-assessment of the ethical, legal, and social implications of deploying an AI system. So in this session, we will discuss which tools are particularly promising and explore the benefits and limitations of adopting these tools more widely in health and care. The NHS AI Lab, through its AI Ethics Initiative, is currently supporting research into augmenting and trialing these tools. So our panelists here today will have an opportunity to share more about the work that they're undertaking as part of the session. So with that all said, let's get started. So my first question today is on challenges of trust in AI. Lizzie, if we can start with you, what are some issues you've encountered or have observed with the trustworthiness of AI in health and care?
Thanks, Brhmie, and hi, everybody. Thanks for organising the panel event. So yeah, I often wonder how I'd feel using AI-driven devices if I was still working on the clinical front line, which I haven't been doing now for a couple of years. And I think the key is trust. You know, as doctors, we're in this privileged role where patients put their trust in us. Generally, the public have some understanding of the level of training that we've gone through, our professional code of practice. So it's expected from doctors, rightly so, that they respect confidentiality, that they don't judge or discriminate, and of course that they have a high level of medical knowledge and keep up to date as medical knowledge increases and as clinical guidelines change. So that way we can provide the best possible care for each patient. So when it comes to AI, we're then asking a clinician to trust a technology to potentially make a clinical decision for them or influence their decision making without a full explanation of how the algorithm came to that decision. So I think it's a big ask, and it therefore doesn't surprise me that there's still quite a lot of reluctance or at least hesitance when I talk to clinicians about using AI. And I think then to add to that, unfortunately, many clinicians have had previous sort of negative experiences of using AI or computer-aided detection softwares in the past. And what I've noticed is it's not only having trust in the quality of the AI itself, the algorithms and the performance, whether they meet the expectations and the standard of care we want to provide in the NHS and other healthcare systems, but it's also the quality of the service that they receive from the company providing the AI. So a lot of the time people say to me, what happens if there's something goes wrong with the AI, say it doesn't work on a scanner that it should be analysing? How am I going to get hold of your company? How quickly will you respond? How will you resolve the problem? So I think as well as the trust in the AI itself, there's also a big sort of trust in the people behind the AI, so that company that provides the AI. And I think that's really important that we develop those positive relationships with clinicians.
Yeah, it's really important to make sure that healthcare professionals, as well as patients and the public, are able to have faith in the systems that they're using. And so it's really great to hear that you recognize that and are doing the work behind the scenes to make sure that that you are able to provide that sort of assurance. Mavis, I wonder if we can hear from you on this question as well.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, it's great to be part of the panel, and I agree with what Lizzie already mentioned about getting clinicians to trust the system. I think there's also, even before this, understanding what definitions we even use and what we mean by AI. Because if we don't have, a definition in which everyone agrees that this is what we mean, then how can we expect clinicians to be able to explain what those systems are doing to people? There's also issues around the different quality that is used to build these AI tools. And we've heard a lot in the recent year too about lack of diversity in data sets, missing data. And so it's thinking about, well, when we think about AI, what is happening to that data? How old is the data that is used to train systems, for instance? But also, does that match to people's experiences of healthcare? Because we can have an amazing tool that is built with the most amazing data, but actually, if that data doesn't really sit well with the way people experience healthcare as a whole system, not just the technology itself, but as a whole system, then people aren't going to trust that. The technology or the system itself. And in this, we know that there are very recent examples. For example, what was happening in the States about 2 years ago, written by a group led by Brhmie and Powers, which was looking at the way AI was used to classify risk for people in America, but actually didn't take the historical inequalities into account. And created a system that actually perpetuated the inequalities that then existed. So I think when we're thinking about the challenges in terms of adopting AI, we have to think about issues beyond just what AI is, but the social structures, the context in which that AI would be adopted, and thinking about, what data is used, how is the bias in the data accounted for, and does the AI itself and the resulting technology actually map with what people expect and experience.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really helpful point, and I'm sure that we'll come on to some of the limitations of these tools later on. But I think I think it's a good thing to note that these tools can't address things like how we account for diverse health needs, or like some of the inequalities in the system, or the systemic inequalities, and potentially replicating that through the development of these algorithms. But I wonder if we could actually just talk about some of the tools or interventions that are currently being developed to improve trustworthiness of AI in health and care. So Brent, can we start with you? It'd be great to hear more about what's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to talk about some of the things that exist that will hopefully improve the situation. So there's lots of different types of tools and interventions that in general are being developed more for a, let's say, a sector neutral approach. So not necessarily specifically for health and care. They're more tools that would be developed generically and that would need to be applied in the health and care space. But I like to think of 3 different categories of tools in general. So you have what I would call documentation standards and impact assessments. So these would be things like data sheets for data sets, model cards for model reporting, data set nutrition labels, basically some type of documentation that should be filled out by the developers of AI systems or the people collecting and curating, say, training data sets, so that you know how the data was collected, what the biases are within it, any potential legal or ethical considerations, these sorts of things. Basically, it's a standardized set of documentation. And similarly, you have algorithmic impact assessments, other sorts of impact assessments, data protection impact assessments that are meant to be applied by organizations developing and using AI that I think cover similar things. And there's a good alignment there between the requirements of the forthcoming Artificial Intelligence Act from the EU and the documentation and logging requirements they have, and these sorts of methods. The second category would be fairness and bias tests, and there's many types of fairness and bias testing. I won't go over them in any detail, but we have at least 30 different ways of measuring fairness in statistical terms. We have many different ways of measuring representativeness and bias in training data and production data. And all I'd say is if you're interested in particular in the fairness metrics, well, there's a session at 12 o'clock that I'll be involved in where I'll delve into much more detail rather than taking up too much time here. And then the third category, which I think is very promising, would be different methods for transparency and explainability, where, say, you're producing explanations of how AI systems work or how they behave at a global level, at a local level, that can be designed for end users, for customers, for expert users, practitioners, clinicians, that sort of thing, depending on who the system is meant to serve. I think a particular challenge you'll see in relation to health and care will be to make sure that when you're using those methods, that they are actually capturing the existing biases and gaps in terms of representation we see in patient data, in access to care, because it could be very, very easy to essentially replicate those problems or not question the status quo, when that's really what these tools are meant to do in order to enhance the trustworthiness of both the system and the environment that it's being used in.
Yeah, and
thanks, Brent. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mavis.
No, I wasn't sure if you were back. I was just going to add to that.
Mavis, it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to what Brent was saying in terms of the impact assessments. It's a great area that is developing quite quickly, and I know that the NHS AI Lab and the ADA have actually been working on some of these tools. Like, one of the things that we've been doing is on the chest imaging, thinking in that as a research project around, well, what does bias look like, and how can we think about assessments right from the beginning. There's work that's coming from Algorithm Watch, for instance. They produce some recommendations around justice and fairness, thinking about transparency and how you can do staged impact assessments within this. And there's obviously, as you already know, the Turing also has a stakeholder impact assessment group. The Canadian government also has an AI impact assessment. So there's a lot that's happening. But for this, we know that whatever we do needs to be transparent. The Data Justice Lab just produced some key insights on algorithm decision-making based on work that the ADA and Understanding Patient Data did a year or so ago. We also produced a report called Foundations of Fairness. And all of these, the underlying theme is be transparent in everything that you do. So in thinking about impact assessments or audits, the tools that we're using need to be publicly available. And I think there's great work going on within that. So this is just to add to what Brent was saying.
Great, thanks, Mavis. So I think it'd be great to actually now start talking about some of the challenges or the limitations of implementing these types of tools or interventions. So Brent, can we start with you on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I hinted at one of the key challenges that I thought existed for these tools, which is in terms of representativeness, and again, just questioning the status quo of how health care is delivered, both in the UK and in different healthcare systems. And I think we can think in terms of challenges that relate to, say, the technical robustness or accuracy of these different methods. If I'm giving you an explanation, for example, of how your case was decided or how a model works, I need to make sure that it's actually correct, that it's delivered to you at a level that is comprehensive, that is useful to you, that you can actually understand based on your understanding of the system and your understanding of relevant methods. And that's a difficult challenge when you are using, say, one tool to provide explanations or to disclose information about how the system is designed to different sorts of audiences. So we really do need to think of, it's not just one set of tools that we're going to be implementing for every system. It's more that you may need different tools. You may need, say, global explanations for actual practitioners, local explanations or case-specific explanations for end users or for patients, just because those are the things that would be most appropriate in terms of what those audiences are interested in, the information that they would actually need. And so, I mean, those are sort of the general challenges that you see with it. But I think there's also some challenges specific to gaps we see in regulation. So there's plenty of gaps that in regulation around AI, say in the GDPR. the requirements that exist there for transparency around automated decision making, but even in forthcoming regulations. So the Artificial Intelligence Act, for example, that's being put out by the EU, that may be a good step forward in terms of getting trustworthiness tools actually in practice and being used in a good way. But there's a real lack of specific requirements in that regulatory framework. There's a lack, say, of specific standards around how bias and fairness would be tested for. In general, those standards will be set by developers or by industry rather than by regulators or say end users. There's no specific requirements to give user explanations. So actually, you as the patient, at least as far as the Artificial Intelligence Act is concerned, there's no specific requirement to give you any level of information. Or, if we're thinking about human oversight, that's a big thing that's being called for in the framework, but it's only called for high-risk systems and when technically feasible to do so. And so if we're using really complex black box systems where we don't understand how they work, it may not be the case that actually this framework gets us any closer to a trustworthy system, because it's not actually constraining how the system is designed. It's just saying, if possible, please make sure human oversight is in place. So yeah, lots of challenges: regulatory, technical, actual use case based, how we implement these tools in organizations, that will require a lot of work over the next few years.
That's a really helpful overview, Brent. Yeah, I think when it comes to regulation, like the UK is obviously also trying to improve the way that we regulate AI as a medical device at the moment. So I think it's helpful to kind of think about how potentially vague the current EU legislation around all of this is, as we're thinking about how to change ours. Lizzie, can we hear your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So thanks, Brent. I agree with all the points you made, and I think as I'm currently working in industry rather than in the NHS, I think I'm sort of seeing it from a different perspective now. And what I've realized is that, as an AI company, we have so many, for want of a nicer way of putting it, but hoops to jump through in terms of regulations. And unfortunately, I think sometimes it is seen like that it's tick box exercises. I'm not saying specifically my company, but I think that's even clinicians from the outside often say, just because you've got a CE mark or FDA, it doesn't mean I necessarily trust you. I know that you've had to do this compliance and tick box. But what about, like you said, the actual trustworthiness and looking at bias and all these things, and the way that we've designed the products from the beginning and thought about the impact on the socioeconomic impact and on society as well as just individuals. So I think my concern is if there's more regulations and more standards coming out that are being designed without the inclusion of industry, sort of sat at the table to help design these tools, then all these great tools will be out there, but you've maybe not got the buy-in from industry to actually implement them. And perhaps if it does become a legal thing and a regulatory thing, of course, then it has to happen. But I think the best way we can do it is by sort of collaborating and actually get all the relevant people involved, and including industry, and get us sort of sat at the table deciding what actually really needs to happen and what's realistic. It will be time and money that we have to spend on these things. So how do we sort of incentivize some of the medtech investors and the decision makers in medtech companies to actually use these tools? And I think that's what, maybe we haven't kind of, as you say, these tools are still probably being developed. And I think that's where I hope that there'll be an inclusion of industry when we think about how we make this kind of pragmatic and really meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, Lizzie. It can't be, entirely top-down regulation or self-regulation. There needs to be some sort of meeting in the middle, and the industry needs to have some sort of voice in order for us to have buy-in. So I wonder if we can kind of talk about some of the practicalities in terms of how we progress with building trustworthiness in AI. So what work are you undertaking to further develop these tools or implement measures that could improve trust and confidence in AI? And this is a question for all of you, but it'd be great to start with Mavis.
Thanks, Brhmie. So as I mentioned earlier, NHSCI and ADA have been working on a chest imaging project. And this really is a great way, I think, to try and start to understand the issues that are needed to be dealt with in building, trustworthy within the system. And, it will be a great test bed to say, okay, what have we learned, and then how can we roll this out nationally, but also moving it out of the public health domain into the private sector, for instance. So some of the work that we're doing at ADA is looking at ways to support how regulation and inspection and audits of AI in the UK might help. And we're trying to base some of this work in Europe. There have been some countries that have created AI registers, like in France and Helsinki, for instance. Helsinki is not a country, but is it? My geography is terrible. But yeah, so there are there's some places in the EU that have AI registers, and so we're trying to figure out how we can support something like that within the UK. And we also did work with DataKind to understand, like I said earlier, what we even mean by these terms, because I think understanding what we're talking about will progress towards building trustworthiness. But we also know that we're more than AI or more than technology. So beyond just the tools, we need to figure out who else needs to be at the table when we're talking about, ethics or trustworthy AI. And it's beyond, like, yes, we bring in industry, yes, we bring in clinicians, but we also bring in the arts and humanities. And we had a great workshop last week, convening people from these different disciplines, because the questions that we ask are just going to be a little bit more, a little bit different, a little bit wider, but also always considering how do we then bring in public expectations about AI, about the use of their data that is then used to create these AI tools into these conversations. And a final thing that we're also doing is thinking about how AI and the tech itself will also impact health and social inequalities. So we're leading on a project with the Health Foundation, trying to understand issues around the data divide and how this impacts, not just the AI society as well. And I think looking at this as a whole ecosystem rather than as one thing, because you can't have trustworthiness only in one particular area of people's lives. It needs to be within the whole NHS as a system. And yeah, those are some of the things that we're doing.
Thanks, Mavis. Brent, can we hear from you on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I would just say something about some of the work I've already done, and then sort of the next thing that I'll be doing. So I've done a fair amount of work around developing different sort of accountability or trustworthiness tools that, roughly fall in the categories I mentioned earlier. So I've helped develop counterfactual explanations. So that's basically a user-friendly method of explaining the behavior of black box systems. That's been implemented by a number of companies. So it's in Google Cloud now, for example. Vodafone, HSBC have used it. But it's the sort of thing where you really do have to look at how it's implemented in an organization to make sure it's being used in a sort of robust way, in an honest way, and in a way that's ultimately useful either for the end users or the practitioners that are getting these explanations. I've also done work in the space of fairness and bias testing. So I developed a metric called conditional demographic disparity that lines up with the requirements of non-discrimination law, both in the UK and the EU. And that's been implemented by Amazon, so it's available to all customers of Amazon Web Services now. And likewise, again, I'll be talking about this a bit more in the 12 o'clock session, developed this notion of bias preservation, which basically says when we're using, or when we're thinking about things like fairness and bias in the space of AI, again, according to non-discrimination law, certain ways of thinking about it, certain ways of measuring it, will be more or less acceptable or align more or less with the aims of the law, in the sense that really we should be questioning the status quo and we should be using metrics that will actually capture, say, the biases that exist in society and try to improve them rather than just taking it as a neutral starting point. So that's what I've done already. And in the future, in the near future, I'll have a project coming up, it looks like, with NHSX and with Aidence, looking at how we do trustworthiness auditing in the space of healthcare and in scientific research. And really, we're thinking of trustworthiness in that project as not a characteristic of the system itself, but more a feature of the environment and the people that are using it, and something that needs to be maintained over the life cycle of the system rather than just being designed for before the system is actually being used. And really, the questions that we'll be answering in that project will be, we have all of these different accountability and trustworthiness tools. There's far too many checklists and impact assessments and fairness metrics and all these things that have been developed. But what we're really lacking is real world evidence of their effectiveness. We don't know if they actually make a difference in practice. And so that's essentially what we'll be doing in the project. We'll be looking at, how effective are these things? How can they be used in a way that is both good for the customer, for the patient, for the end user, but also, effective and is bought into within an organization. And so, yeah, that should be a really exciting project. I'm looking forward to that one.
Thanks, Brent. Lizzie, it'd be great if you could expand on that.
Yeah, sure. So obviously very excited to have the opportunity to work with Brent on this project. So I won't go into more detail on that. But other things within Aidence, so I suppose there's external projects that we try and get involved in. So for example, this one with Brent and NHSX. I think then there's the opportunity we've had with the NHSX AI Award, and that's I think in terms of trust, what that's going to really help us gain is evidence, so an evaluation of the actual clinical impact and broader impact on health economics of our device, and it's being evaluated by an expert external group, and that funding has allowed us to do that. So hopefully that will help with trust, because obviously, a lot of clinicians, understandably, we need evidence. It's evidence-based medicine, and I think the more evidence we can get, that will also help improve people's trust in algorithms. But that's expensive. So things that we're able to do sort of internally, a bit more within our control, is a bit on education. So I think I'm really lucky being able to ask any questions I want to data scientists, because I work with them every day. I have that ability to question the status quo, to question things, find out why things are working the way they are. And what we're trying to do now is actually sort of communicate that externally, so to whether it is our end users, which are clinicians, or whether it's the patient and public that might be impacted by our software. So we've started this Opening the Black Box series to do some educational information for people aimed at either clinicians or the patient and public. And then there's also a piece we're doing on our user training, and I think that links back a bit to what we've said earlier. I think user training is so important, and at the moment there aren't any standards or sort of a benchmark of what information we should be providing to the end user, what level of detail they need to understand about the AI that they're using. It's a balance of not overwhelming them and making them think they need a data science degree or a degree in machine learning, but it's like being able to provide them enough information to empower them and give them confidence in using the tool. And, we all know that AI isn't perfect, and therefore they need to recognize when to maybe reject its results as opposed to accepting the results. And that's something that I'm really trying to work on with our current users, and getting feedback from them and understanding from them what more information they need to know to give them more confidence in using AI.
Thanks, Lizzie. I'm really excited to hear about everyone's work in this space. I feel like there are a lot of interesting projects and quite a variety as well. So my final question today for everyone is kind of a key takeaway for us. So what more could the NHS or the NHS AI Lab do to ensure the trusted adoption of these technologies? So again, I think it'd be great to hear from everyone. Brent, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the challenges specifically for the NHS that we should be thinking about, we have to think about how AI is impacting on core clinical relationships and core clinical interactions. The AI systems that seem to be, that people seem to be talking about the most right now in the healthcare space, to me are trying to do one of two things. Either they're trying to automate some of the more routine or labor intensive tasks that doctors need to do, which, it's fantastic. Or they are trying to somehow be embedded in the patient interaction in the sense of almost like a chatbot type system or a triage system. And it's those ones in particular where I think we really need to be paying attention to how that is changing the role of the doctor. I think you would be hard pressed to find too many doctors that would be against the idea of automating some of their more routine or labor intensive tasks that are very repetitive. But when it comes to actually interacting with the patient, that's really where a lot of medical ethics is concerned, and where we could start to, I think, see some harmful effects emerge from these systems. In the same way that if you call up for customer service to a company and you get a chatbot or you get an automated system, you can very quickly become frustrated with it and feel like you're not being taken seriously. And I think we need to be very careful to make sure we don't get any effects that are anywhere near that school of effects, let's say, in the space of healthcare. So I'd like to see a lot more attention being paid to the impact of AI on the doctor-patient relationship.
I think that's a fair point. Lizzie?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to go back to the role that I think NHS or the AI lab have in sort of setting the standards and the benchmark of the quality of AI that we allow into clinical practice in the NHS. And I think there's lots of different areas I could look at, but I think one thing, as I said, is the user training, and that could be set by NHS. What sort of criteria? We could standardize that to make sure that actually, because I think what concerns me is, as a previous radiologist, if suddenly I was to be overwhelmed by, 10 different companies supplying different algorithms for different imaging and diseases that I'm looking for, and they all explain their AI in totally different ways to me, and they do their training in different ways, and I can see myself getting confused about what's the intended use of this AI algorithm, what are the limitations, what's the performance that I should be expecting. And so I think if that format almost of training can be standardized from the NHS to say, I personally think that would help clinicians be able to more quickly become confident using different AI algorithms for the at the right time and for the right patients. So I think that would be my main thing. I think is where I think they could help now.
That's useful. And finally, Mavis.
Thank you. I think for me, it's two main things. One is that the people whose data is used to train the AI should also be the people who benefit from AI. And a lot of the times you might find that the way technology and research goes is we collect data from groups of people, but actually in then rolling out the systems, people don't benefit in the same way. So it's thinking about, which areas are these technologies being rolled out, and are they the areas most in need? How are we defining need in that space? But also something that Brett said about the impact, actually, and Lizzie, the impact on the economies and the impact of jobs. AI involves people, and the people that we are, asking to make use of this AI, also the people that are, being impacted on the other side. So it's making sure that we recognize the kind of interaction between the social and the technical, and whether we're using, for instance, AI as a medical device or a decision tool, we need to be explicit about who has responsibility and accountability. And then kind of a third thing, on the back of what's been happening with, the GPDPR, is thinking about the contestations around data and what's used to create AI, but also who is creating those systems, which partnerships the NHS is choosing to pursue. Because I think a lot of the trustworthiness or the lack of trust comes from this kind of gray area of people not understanding how these partnerships are created. And so actually, if you have standards, you also have to have standards about who comes in to train the data or use the data sets to build these AI systems. So I think there's something about the NHS as a brand being more transparent about how it's creating these partnerships that are then being used to create AI.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about transparency. And we do have the new Center for Better Data Collaboration. So hopefully they'll be able to shed some light on how we go about making these sorts of decisions. So I wanted to take one question from the audience. And Lizzie, it sounds like this might be a good one for you. So it's about, I guess, algorithms where the end user could be potentially any frontline worker. And the question is around how can physicians with no expert knowledge on the specific disease trust the device?
Yeah, great question. And I think that goes back to my point about, I really think it's the responsibility of the AI company, the providers of the company, to provide good quality explanations of the device and the algorithm. And that goes from, we need to explain what data was used to train the algorithm, how it's been tested, hopefully robustly pre-market, but also post-market, what sort of monitoring we're doing to make sure that it is working the way it's expected within your local hospital or trust. And I think we can, now that I've been working in it for 2 years, and I'm not a data scientist, but I think I now understand sort of it's that level of information we provide to clinicians and or other healthcare professionals who will be responsible for using that device. And we need to find that balance. And I think, like I said, that's why we need to work with these end users to figure out what's the right balance of information that we give you, so that you do feel confident in using it, whether, and from whatever experience you have in AI or in that disease. And that's a really important thing to think of, because I think so far I see that the people that I engage with initially will be those early adopters, the ones excited about AI. Whereas I think what I'm really keen on is making sure we make it just as accessible and understandable for the people that have no previous interest or data science background. And that's where we really need to find that balance. And I do think we have a responsibility as health tech industry to maybe do that in collaboration with the NHS, and certainly work together with the users.
I think that's a really great answer. And yes, definitely. I feel like this is something that NHS AI Lab definitely want to work on and collaborate with industry on, as well as civil society and academics. And that's what we're trying to do through this AI ethics initiative. But that's all of the questions that we have time for today. Thank you to our audience, as well as to our panelists. I've really enjoyed hearing your insights today. So thank you for sharing them with us. And I'm really looking forward to working with you all on progressing some of these tools to improve trustworthiness in AI.